bit what Jesus was talking about, or at least what Paul was talking about in Romans. I want you to think for a second about Darwin. Remember, Darwin essentially says survival of the fittest, right? And animals that have these certain instincts that are going to be good in the primal arena are going to be the ones that survive. The problem is that model doesn't necessarily work with human beings. Human beings don't operate on the model of survival of the fittest. In fact, some of the things that in the human arena compel us to be most successful are virtuous things like empathy, compassion, and love, which aren't necessarily primal. Those are more virtuous. And sometimes the virtuous things and the primal things might go hand in hand. Like you say, lust is primal, love is virtuous. But the thing about those things is that they're actually complementary at some degree. If you're in a relationship with someone, right, you want a little bit of lust, but if it's only lust, it's not going to be a good relationship. If it's only love and there's no attraction, no lust, you're also going to have something that's missing. But when the two complement each other, when love comes together with lust, and it comes together with relationship, and it comes together with empathy and friendship and compassion, the relationship actually takes a stronger hold were it to be simply based on the virtuous things. So human beings are essentially different than the rest of the animal kingdom because we don't live in the model of survival of the fittest. We don't operate only in the Darwinian model. We operate in a model that I'm actually going to call spiritual or religious, and that seems to be, I think, what Jesus is talking about as well, and the rabbis are going to talk about when they talk about Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara. Again, Yetzer Hara, primal inclination, Yetzer HaTov, virtuous inclinations that we have.
So what you're saying is that both are in us, but you're avoiding good and bad. You're not saying that one is either.
Yeah, I think the language actually holds us back from really, truly understanding it. And look, I think the world in which we live doesn't live in a black and white model versus good versus evil and good versus evil. That's not a helpful dichotomy, or even good and bad. You actually have to understand more fundamentally what we're talking about. And again, primal, animalistic versus virtuous, spiritual. And one of the things that we find in a lot of the parables that we're going to look at are names and symbols are incredibly important. So for example, there is a name that we're going to look at. The name of this individual is not a historical figure. His name is Chia Bar Ashi. If you're a Yiddish speaker out there and your grandmother called you a wilde chaya, she was calling you a wild animal. So Chaya means an animal, Bar means son of, and Ashi or Aish in Hebrew means fire. So animal, son of fire. Two different symbols that you're going to see when we're talking about Yetzer Hara, the primal inclination. Again, primal animalistic, they're recognizing that. But then fire, I think, is also kind of an interesting symbol that they often choose as well. Burning desire within you. But fire is not necessarily a bad thing. It can scald you and it can warm you, right? You can cook with it, or it can be the thing that destroys you. And that's an intentional symbol that we're playing on. So we got to get rid of the dichotomy of don't do this and do this, good versus evil, and we've got to actually start to look at Yetzer Hara and Yetzer HaTov, the good and the evil, or the primal and the virtuous, as things that can complement each other, and that's what the parables that we're going to look at show. And I'm going to venture to say that there's definitely tension in our Jewish parables. There's definitely tension amidst Gospels and Paul, and probably even one gospel to the next gospel. Mm-hmm. And they probably have different views on things.
And then you get into Christian theologians who took it to a different level and maybe went off into left field. We'll find out.
No, but I kind of want to hear, I want to frame it a little more with, I want you to say more about original sin again, and why you're
I'm a little cautious about.
Yeah,
because I think that a lot of this tension you're talking about was a struggle in the struggle in the early church. So we're talking about the Second Temple period, right? Things are evolving in Judaism, but they're evolving in Christianity, and there's tensions with other religions, religious influences in the Roman world. So you have a theologian named Augustine of Hippo. Augustine is one of those pillars of Christian theology as it evolved. He writes in the 300s. He wrote a book called Confessions. And in Confessions, he's the one who coined the word original sin. But if you look at Augustine's biography, he grew up in North Africa. He was part of a Manichaean religion, which was very, you could say, sensual. You know, a lot of what they would call cult prostitution was happening, and he had a good, deep sense of what we would call Catholic guilt. I mean, he felt really bad about this, and so he figured that all of his physical desires, all of that, was evil. He saw a separation between physical and spiritual. And since he didn't think it all came from himself, he blamed it all on Adam and Eve. And so, but he saw it as really not just Adam and Eve, as a sense of human, we were created this way. So he saw the evil inclination as evil, as something that came from the beginning, something that was planted by even a power outside ourselves, by Satan. And this kind of thinking that flesh is evil and that it's inherited, and the only solution then for him was Jesus taking that away. Now this is where Paul comes in. Paul says that as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Jesus is the second Adam. Jesus takes away the sin that Adam brought. But see, all of that presupposes that God created humanity in Adam and Eve, right? And kind of gave us a fatal flaw. And that's where I go back to Genesis, the end of the first chapter of Genesis. God looks on everything God made, and it was very good. And if we're all created in the image of God, then wait a minute, you know? So I'm curious, because that sense of original sin, or even the role of Adam and Eve, is not the same in Judaism, is it?
No, we don't necessarily see ourselves as being created with original sin, but we do see the Yetzer Hara, the primal inclination, develop within us at a certain point. The rabbis are going to say there's a line from Noah, the story of Noah, where it says that the Yetzer was with him from his youth. I say, oh yeah, from your youth, you actually develop these kind of primal urges that become a part of who you are. And again, I don't think it's necessarily about good, evil. I think it's really about human nature. And I think as we look at this text, the first one that I've given us, we're going to see that they're going to almost reject good as a concept. And the only thing that they're going to call good is the Yetzer Hara, the primal inclination. So let's look at this text. It's fascinating. So Rabbi, we're on page 1, Bereshit Rabbah. This is a interpretive text from probably about the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. Rabbi Nachman said in Rabbi Shmuel's name, "Behold, it was good." So they're quoting Genesis. And when it says, "Vayihi Tov," it was good in Genesis, they're saying actually what this refers to, because they're talking about the creation of, again, animals. It's good. This refers to the good inclination, the Yetzer HaTov. And behold, it was very good refers to the Yetzer Hara. Wait a second. You're telling me that the Yetzer Hara, the primal inclination, is better than your virtuous inclination? Well, let's read. It only says very good after humankind was created with both good and bad inclinations. In all other cases, it only says that it was good. So again, what they're qualifying is saying that it's not that the Yetzer Hara is good, it's that humanity was good only when humanity had both primal and virtuous inclinations that were combined together. And then they're going to talk about, again, how can the Yetzer Hara, the primal inclination, again, here they're kind of toying with evil desire. How can evil desire be very good? But I warn you against the language. That would be extraordinary. That can't be the case. But without the Yetzer Hara, without this primal desire, no man would build a house, take a wife, beget children. And thus Solomon said, again, I considered all labor and all excelling in work. It is a man's rivalry with their neighbor. Essentially, the jealousy, the competition, the greed is what fuels the advancement of humankind. The Yetzer Hara, responsible for business, responsible for procreation. It's responsible for the advancement of the world in which we live. Without it, the world would be lame. And in fact, there's a great other parable, I'm going to tell it very briefly, that plays on this idea as well. There is a story that's told in the Talmud about the rabbis who actually are able to capture the Yetzer Hara, and they're able to bottle it up. And guess how the Yetzer Hara appears? It appears as a fiery lion. Again, all the imagery, which we already know. Fire, lion, animal. And they bottle it up and they start celebrating. Look, we got it. We got it. We got rid of that thing. And then what happens is the world starts to fall apart. By the way, where does the lion come from? It comes from the Holy of Holies, another symbol of it coming from the most holy place in the world. And they bottle it up, the world starts to fall apart, and they essentially realize what they had done. They let it go and they cry to heaven, "Heaven, can we just get rid of half of it?" And a great line, which is one of my favorite lines from the Talmud, heaven calls out, "Heaven doesn't grant half. Take it or leave it. You got to have both. It's got to be a part of your lives in balance with the Yetzer HaTov. You can't simply have virtue without having that which is primal." Again, how can the Yetzer Hara be very good? Because it is responsible for the world in which we live in one of the most positive ways possible. That's a pretty bold statement from the rabbis.
It actually reminds me of Jungian psychology, your shadow side, and connecting both rather than ignoring, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that both are in you.
Yeah, I mean, there's this just, I think, a weird spiritual habit. It's a bad spiritual habit, by the way. Maybe it's a spiritual inclination to try to get rid of that which you think doesn't belong in the spiritual realm of your life. And I think that's what Jimmy Carter was doing in many ways, or what Matthew was saying. Get rid of every thought that is impure, every part of you that doesn't belong in the spiritual realm of the world. And the problem is you can only bottle it up for so long. You have to realize that being created human, you actually have to acknowledge your primal inclinations, or else when it comes out, it will do so in a way that's excessive and inappropriate. So is the Yetzer Hara good? Yes. When it comes out in excess, is it still good? Probably not. Right? What does Yetzer Hara look like in excess? Well, let's start with take something like ambition. Ambition is a pretty good thing. It compels you to be better, but if you put it in an excessive form, excessive ambition, what's the word I'm looking for? What might you call that? Maybe it's going to breed other stuff like greed or self-centeredness or cutthroatness, some of these terrible qualities that come out in excess. I would say sexuality on a spectrum also works in the same kind of way, but you probably need both sides of the spectrum here. You need love, and probably if you have lust in excess, never really a good thing. So you can't just throw out the Yetzer Hara. You've got to value it, you've got to acknowledge it, and you've got to see how it actually makes you a more complete person. I mean, that might be consistent with part of Jesus' teachings.
This is where Jesus' teachings, the church has messed this up, and you can see this in that kind of spiritual excess of being pure, but then the mighty fall, the farthest, right?
Oh, that's
and
what's
you
about to come up.
You see this in church leaders all the time, and then you hear somebody, there was an affair, or there was abuse, or there was, but it's people who put themselves up on this spiritual pillar, but if they completely denied this side of yourself, and so it comes out somewhere else. One of the scriptures that I gave here was Jesus says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cut it out, and if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And I say to people who struggle with the word metaphor, right? It's not about physically cutting your hand off or plucking your eye. It's being aware of behaviors and kind of putting brakes on when you realize that you're getting into the excessive zone, to use the language you were talking about. But it's not cutting off body parts, it's not cutting off people, it's cutting off behaviors that are pulling you the wrong way. So let's go a little farther into the parables here.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of which one to start with. Kind of want to start with this guy named Chia bar Ashi, who I mentioned before. Again, his name means animal, son of fire. We are on page 3 now. And a lot of the parables that I've picked are laden with innuendo. And the innuendo, if you think something seems a little bit sexual and what they're trying to suggest, it is. But it goes back to the point of, can you bottle it all up? And here the answer is going to be no, you can't do that. So Rabbi Chia bar Ashi was accustomed to say, whenever he would fall on his face in prayer, so when he would pray this, he'd said, "Oh, merciful one, save me from the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination." And one day his wife heard him saying this prayer, and she said, "It's been several years since he's withdrawn from engaging in intercourse with me due to his advanced years. What's the reason that he's saying this prayer, as there's no concern that he's going to engage in sinful sexual behavior?" In fact, there's a requirement in the Talmud that Chia bar Ashi would have surely have known, that the husband is responsible for satisfying his wife sexually, and clearly he has not fulfilled his obligation because he's been saying this prayer, "Let my urges be subdued," over and over again. And what's ended up happening is he's bottling it up for so long, even though he does have the urges. And the irony, too, is that in suppressing what is supposed to be an evil inclination, he's actually violating his wife's needs that are not just, suggested, but mandated that he actually fulfill his wife's sexual needs. So let's see what happens. One day while he was studying in his garden, she adorned herself and repeatedly passed him. She's dressing up in costume. And he says, "Who are you?" She said, "I am Charuta." Charuta in Hebrew means kind of haughty. That might be the best way to describe it. Yeah. So haughty, he says, "I am haughty, a well-known prostitute returning from my day at work." And so he propositions her. Again, this is the kind of what you don't want to do with your Yetzer Hara. Let it come out in the form of engaging in prostitution, but that's what he does. So she says to him, "Give me that pomegranate from the top of the tree as payment." And I think there's a little innuendo here going on. I'll let you read into it however you want. So he leapt up, went, and brought it to her, and they engaged in intercourse. When he came home, his wife was lighting a fire in the oven. Again, more fire imagery. He went and sat inside, the fire that is, and she said to him, "What are you doing?" He said to her, "Well, such and such happened today." He told her all that happened, including he engaged in prostitution. She said, "It was me." He paid no attention to her, thinking that she was merely trying to comfort him, until she gave him signs that it was indeed her. Like, I think you can imagine how that scene might go. Mm-hmm. He says to her, "In any event, I intended to transgress. I might not have actually transgressed, but it was sin that was in my heart, I guess you might say." And the Talmud says essentially, all the days of that righteous man, he would fast for the transgression he intended to commit until the day that he died in his misery. I don't think the conclusion is meant to be a dig at those who have sin in their heart or have intention to sin. I think it's meant to say, if you let sin in your heart, or if you let the inclination within you, or the thought that you might commit sin consume you so much, it's going to not only ruin your marriage, it's going to ruin your life. Fascinating story here. What happens when you bottle up the Yetzer Hara, your primal inclination that you were meant to have in the first place? You end up ruining your marriage, you end up ruining your life, and you live the rest of your days in misery. That might be how I understand the story. Any thoughts?
I don't want to end in misery, but the parable before this is interesting because the one you just read, it's all about this guy, and it's about him bottling up. What I want you to think about for a moment, because Christians have a easy out here. They'll say, the devil made me do it.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I'll get in real trouble here. I'm not sure about the devil either. But I know evil exists, but is there a personification? When you personify it, it takes away responsibility. But it also raises this question. It's like, okay, so this parable that we just read it's up to him. He's the one who made the mistake.
He's got agency.
The one above, it's Satan. So I'm just curious about how that figures in. Is there a force outside us forcing us to do this, or are we doing it on our own, or how does that work?
I think we have to describe what Hasatan, or Satan, is in the Jewish tradition, because I think Christianity takes it a little bit in another direction. Mm-hmm. Satan does exist in the Bible. Hasatan means the adversary. Mm-hmm. And in the book of Job, it's a very clear, some kind of angelic figure that argues or contends with God. And the idea of the adversary is the legal adversary, right? It exists in Psalms as well. It's the thing meant to kind of push your virtuous desire. And yes, it's personified almost as a person or an angel, but I think we don't really read it as the literal personification of somebody. We read it as, or a literal person, we read it as almost, in the literary sense, it represents the nagging, I'm going to use a cartoon image here, the angel that's on your shoulder in a cartoon that's telling you to do the bad thing, but not an actual angel. And I think what we're going to actually see when we look at the story is that, it's comedy. It's great rabbinic comedy when they're telling the story, but I don't want you to think that, look, Jews believe in Satan too, as a figure that is red and has horns and a tail and looks like the devil, but really some kind of representation of the Yetzer Hara in our lives. Should we look at
why don't we dive into that one? And then there's more where that came from. We'll get there.
The sage Plemu had the habit of saying every single day, an arrow in the eye of Satan, or the Aramaic for it is Gira be'ene de Satan. So again, it's just the saying that he had. An arrow in the eye of Satan. Like, Satan's nothing, let's throw an arrow in his eye. And he would, so essentially, he would mock the temptations of the Yetzer Hara. One day, it was the eve of Yom Kippur, which, by the way, is the most holy day of the year for Jews, and Satan appeared to him as a pauper who came and called him to the door, requesting alms. Plemu brought out some bread to him. Satan said to him, "On a day like today, everyone is inside eating, and shall I stand outside and eat?" And so again, Plemu is trying to be virtuous here, right? He's trying to tap into that good inclination, that virtuous inclination, and Hasatan is going to push him every step of the way. So Plemu brought him, where'd I go? Plemu brought him inside and gave him bread. He said to him, "On a day like today, everyone is sitting at the table, and shall I sit by myself?" So they brought him and sat him at the table. He was sitting and he was covered in boils and pus, and he was doing repulsive things at the table. So Plamu says to the pauper, "Sit properly and do not act in a revolting manner." Satan then said to him, "Give me a cup." They gave him a cup. He coughed up his phlegm and spat it into the cup. They berated him for acting this way, at which point Satan pretended to sink down and die. They heard people around them saying, "Plamu killed a man, Plamu killed a man." I mean, you can imagine this scene playing out. This guy, Plamu, who's trying to do the right thing, but is just pushed. All the buttons are pushed, and now it seems like it's turning into the most embarrassing thing for him. Plamu fled and hid himself in the bathroom. Satan followed him and fell before him. Upon seeing that Plamu was suffering, he revealed himself to him, and Satan said to him, "What's the reason that you spoke this way, provoking me by saying, 'An arrow in the eye of Satan'?" He replied, "But what then should I say?" And Satan said to him, "Let the master Plamu say, 'Let the merciful one rebuke the Satan.'"
So what does that mean?
I mean, one, I think it's the reminder that no one should ever be so virtuous or so full of themselves to say that the Yetzer Hara ain't no thing. Like, it's a thing. We all got it. In fact, there's a great saying in the Talmud that is, the greater the person, the greater the Yetzer Hara. Again, the greater the person, the greater the primal inclination. It's because you're going to have more opportunities, as greed is going to tempt you more, sexuality is going to tempt you more, the greater the individual you are. And if you are simply going to say, "Look how great I am, I can simply mock the Yetzer Hara," it's going to come back and it's going to bite you. And so don't bottle it up, don't pretend it doesn't exist. At the very least, you've got to acknowledge that it's there.
So let me show you a parable of Jesus and the young man. It's on page 6, Matthew 19. This is a story that shows up in each of the Gospels, slightly different in versions, but it's basically one. It says one. Matthew just says one, but in Luke it's a rich young ruler comes to Jesus saying, "What?" And he uses rabbi, by the way. "What good deed must I do to have eternal life?" So Jesus says, "Why you ask me what is good? One there is who is good." And that one, by the way, is pointing to God, not us. "If you would enter life, keep the commandments." And he says, "Which?" "Well, you shall not kill, etc., etc." And the young man says, "All these I have observed from my youth," is what it says in Luke. And it says, Jesus looks at him and says, "If you would go sell what you have, give to the poor, you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." The next line there says, "And the young man left sorrowful, for he had great possessions." In other words, he couldn't do it. He couldn't, I'm going to obey. I'm a Boy Scout. I did all my right things. I'm just perfect. And he's going to Jesus really to get a pat on the head. And Jesus says, "Yeah, no, you haven't, you've done all these things. Yes, I'm so proud of you. But now you have to really live it out." And he can't, right? So this is, is that a failure, or is that just a recognition of his humanity? Is that, how does that?
I love the idea that he says, 10 Commandments, do the 10 Commandments, right? And that's the baseline. And 10 Commandments, you don't do them, and it doesn't make you a great person. It just makes you, those are don't kill, don't steal, don't bear false witness against your neighbor, baseline commandments. And he's saying, I do the baseline, right? But the next elevation step above that, I think, is the spiritual realm of how you live a virtuous life. And doing the 10 Commandments isn't excessively virtuous. It's just what you do in order to live in a civil religious society. But again, what you're acknowledging is the virtue is sell your possessions and help the poor. Can you give of yourself in a way that is actually really virtuous, is really spiritual? And to that, he simply cannot
couldn't do it.
Yeah, he couldn't do it. You might
So
say the Yetzer Hara, the greed might
the greed took over. He couldn't do both.
Yeah.
Again, in Romans, underneath that, the next one, let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to that was good, love one another, outdo each other in showing honor. You know, it just keeps going on and on and on. Repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Leave wrath to God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So is he saying here, this might be slightly different, because that's really saying let the Yetzer Hara let God deal with that side, and I think you deal with the spiritual. Is that?
In a certain sense, especially with vengeance. I don't think vengeance is Yetzer Hara. Vengeance, like acting out vengeance, is clearly transgression or clearly sin. And I think what we're talking about is the concept of sin versus the actualization of sin. And I think the examples that are generally given here are actualization of virtue and versus actualization of sin. And I think that might just lead us into like the understanding of what is sin overall and how does it affect us and who we are. I think the Jewish view, we talked a little bit about the idea of teshuvah, I think on one of the first sessions where we were talking about repentance. We talked about the idea of teshuvah, repentance is after you've gone astray, being able to come back to the path that you were meant to be on. And that's how you make essentially amends for the problems or for the strain off the path. But I would actually say that we actually have to understand that there are certain actions that aren't just simply walking back on the path, that are really cold, hardcore, wrong things to do. I think vengeance would be one of them, acting out on vengeance in such a way that you might kill somebody. It's murder. It's the actualization of the feeling that you have as murder. Completely wrong. There's no real recovery from that kind of a sin. There's no just walking right back on the path. So I think in certain dichotomies, maybe it's a little more apt, which is the idea of sin, like actually doing it, versus doing that which is good. And I think there's a little bit of a difference. Maybe in that respect, the dichotomy actually works a little better than between virtuous behavior or virtuous inclinations and sinful inclinations.
Well, and what I see here is some of the pushing to virtuous inclinations, taking it to the next level, as you said, above the commandments. That's not excessive. That's actually expected. Right? It's kind of fascinating. I printed out a Cherokee story that I think a lot of people have heard of the two wolves. Do you know that story? There's an elder man who is speaking to his grandson, and he says, I have two wolves on my shoulders, a evil wolf and a good wolf that are battling with each other. And the grandson says, which wolf wins? And he says, the wolf I feed. And so that's, and that idea that we have both inside us, it's like which muscle do we exercise and get stronger? The difference with that though is pretty much a good versus evil. And what we've been pushing at is it's not good versus evil. It's inclinations and that both can be useful. Both can be good if they're directed appropriately.
That's right. It reminds me too of a Simpsons episode of the character Lisa, young adolescent daughter, tells her father, she says, there's a battle within each and every person, a battle between good and evil that rages on. Then Homer has this, thought, this dream about what that looks like. And it's a little evil Homer with maracas dancing on the grave of good Homer, singing, I am evil Homer, I am evil Homer. And it's a great, great Simpsons scene, I promise you. Where shall we go next? How much time do we have? We got a little bit of time.
Well, did we get, there's a third parable here, isn't there?
Yeah. I think we missed one of the
I think we missed
parables.
one of them on page 4, right?
Okay. One of the places where I think we're going to have to get a little bit more specific with, in terms of how we understand what the Yetzer Hara is, sexuality is probably the most common Yetzer Hara primal inclination. I love the way that they describe it in the scripture in the New Testament as carnal inclination, or your carnal side, and very much what the rabbis are going to focus on often in the parables that they tell are the carnal side of us. And so this is going to be about sexuality and the reminder that there's this, even for the most pious among us, because there is going to be a person whose name is literally Amram the Pious. Going back to the idea, the greater the person, the greater the Yetzer Hara. The rabbis are going to stack and tell a series of stories in the Talmud about every single rabbi who you esteem and put on such a big pedestal, to remind you that this is not an exclusive thing to us ordinary folk, but even the greatest rabbis of all time are still going to struggle with the very things that we're struggling with, especially sexuality, which is something that I think is taboo in the culture to talk about, but the rabbis do want to write about it in order to remind us that this is a part of human nature. So, the story of women who were captive and brought to Nehardea. Essentially what happens is there's something that goes on in the ancient world where there's a redemption of captives. Unfortunately, what happened was that certain people would kidnap Jewish women and then hold them ransom for the Jewish community to essentially redeem them as captives or pay the ransom. And so these women are redeemed from captive. They want to make sure that they're not harmed, and so they're held in the place that would be the most safe place to put them that you could possibly imagine, right? The house of Amram, the pious, because Amram is, of course, pious. So they bring these women to the house of Amram, these women who are held captive, and here's what happens. So they bring them up to the house of Amram. They bring them to a higher floor in the house, and they remove the ladder. Essentially, they're doing so that nobody could access them. Seemingly, that's what's going on. But again, if you thought that Chia Bar Ashi story was laden with innuendo, wait till you see what happens here. They removed the ladder before them to prevent men from climbing up after them to the attic where they were to sleep. When one of them passed the entrance to the upper chamber, it was as though a light shone in the aperture due to their great beauty. Out of his desire for her, Rav Amram grabbed the ladder that 10 men couldn't lift, and he lifted it on his own and began climbing. Okay. Lot of imagery here about phallic objects being straightened, and you kind of get the idea. So he begins climbing, and when he was halfway up the ladder, he strengthened his legs against the side of the ladder to stop him from climbing any further. And he raised his voice and cried out, there's a fire in the house of Amram. Upon hearing this, the sages came forward and found him in that vulnerable position. And they said to him, you have embarrassed us, since everyone sees what you had intended to do. Rav Amram said to them, it's better that you be shamed in Amram's house in this world and not ashamed of him in the world to come. He took an oath that his evil inclination should emerge from him, and an apparition similar to a pillar of fire emerged from him. Okay, that's really an interesting image. He said to his evil inclination, see, as you are fire and I am mere flesh, and yet I am still superior to you, as I was able to overcome you. Couple different big ideas that we get from the story. One, I think, is that even the most pious, and especially the most pious, are ones with sexual desire. Don't see them on such a pedestal that you would ever believe that they don't have this Yetzer Hara, this primal inclination, just like each and every one of us, and in fact, all the more so, almost. Another thing that I see is the community support is actually pretty necessary. And like talking it, saying it out loud, acknowledging that it's actually there. Can you say, fire in the house of Amram, like, I need help. I need you guys to come around me and support me. I'm acknowledging that my Yetzer Hara is there, and it's taboo. It's shameful to have to talk about it, but you know what? It's better that I make everybody else uncomfortable with the fact that I'm talking about the Yetzer Hara within me. Better that than that I should actually give into the very temptation and do the thing that would put me in the worst kind of shame possible. Again, the actualization of the Yetzer Hara to the point where it actually becomes sin. So that's another thing that I see from the story.
So getting back to Jimmy Carter,
Yeah.
he sinned in his mind, but he didn't actually get around to the physical part of it. So was he saved from sinning? And this parable would say,
Absolutely.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't help but laugh when I hear Jimmy Carter say that, and I've seen the clips of it. You have sin in your heart and you're ashamed of it? Actually have sin in your heart and, be proud that you're actually able to acknowledge it and be vulnerable, and that you're able to tell your entire country and the people who you're leading not to look up to me in such a way that you're going to deify me or make me a saint to say that I never sin or don't have urges like everybody else. To be a human being is to have both the primal and the virtuous inclinations within us, and they do go together, but you don't have to be embarrassed or shamed by it in that kind of way. And I almost felt like his intention behind that was a confession.
Well, so this is we're almost out of time, but an interesting question then. The role of confession in absolution, the idea of, we in the Episcopal Church, we do have the Catholic tradition of a private confession with a priest, but honestly it's very rare. What we do have in our liturgical tradition, though, is every Sunday service has a public public confession. And what is the role of, I have done those things which we ought to have done. I've done those things we ought not to have done. That's an old version of it in there, those things, confessing what we have done and left undone. But sometimes leaving things undone is actually a good thing, right?
By the way, we have public confession too. On the high holidays, we have a whole part called the vidui, which means the confession. And we go through this litany of sins. We say, like, for all the sins that I've committed against not honoring my father and mother, for all the sins that I've committed against being deceitful and fraudulent. And you might be saying a lot of the time when you're reading these public confessions, this one doesn't apply to me. This one doesn't apply to me. I didn't do this. I didn't do this. But at the very least, when you're reading those things, you might actually acknowledge the Yetzer Hara that you have within you to do those things. And when you're able to say it out loud, it almost becomes a tool to prevent you from actualizing those things through action. So I actually think confession is not a bad.
I'm not saying it's a bad. I think the public, as you said, is actually in a way more useful, because it's all of us doing that together, recognizing that together. Well, this is really fascinating, and I think that the idea that you began with, that the animal, the natural inclination that is within us, I'm avoiding the word evil, and the virtuous is in both are in both of us, both are in us, in all of us.
Yeah, and I think, what the rabbis do very early is they destigmatize the Yetzer Hara, like by taking away the idea that it's bad. They say it's very good. And I think with language, being able to describe it as primal or carnal actually gives us a more clear understanding that it's not tainted with good or evil. It's just the primal inclination that's within us, and it can be good just as the Yetzer HaTov can be good too.
So I'd do a little Christian thing and throw Jesus into this. And what's interesting to me is the idea that Christians have that Jesus comes to us in human form. Now, you could say he was just perfect and didn't have any feelings or anything like that. It was just God walking around. But that's not what Christian theology says. Christian theology says, really, he's fully human and fully divine, which in the fully human part means that he experienced the same thing. And you see, there's certainly occasions where Jesus gets angry. And you can read between the lines. You see he had relationships and things like that and all over the place. And for me, that makes him more accessible, right? That it's not just some holy thing that is unattainable, but a sense that he would truly understand where I am and what I'm going through because he went through the same thing. There's a sense of Jesus' humanity in there that is as important as his divinity. This whole both and answer that Christianity came up with in the creed. He's this and this, this and this. And that duality is kind of what we're talking about today, that human and divine, or the physical and the spiritual, or however we want to put those two things together.
I have a question. I'm looking around. I see some Jesus on the cross around me. I know some of the Jewish people in here are like, makes me a little uncomfortable. It is okay. But, I find it interesting that Jesus is most holy on the cross in the broken state. And, maybe I'm reading into it a little bit, but we have this idea of when Jesus is on the cross, yes, it's an image of suffering, but I think it's also it's pinnacle Jesus, right? In his broken state.
That sense on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's this moment of complete separation, or is that an owning, a full owning of his humanity? Is that and then it's redeemed. That image is up there of Jesus hanging like this on the cross. That's not my preferred image because the story doesn't end there. And we can get stuck. We can get stuck on the suffering part and not at the death and not get to the resurrection, the whole Easter story. And I think Christianity for a long time saw that image and thought, well, the flesh is evil, or suffering is, you deserve it, or, this kind of thing in there without the redemption side, without the forgiveness or the new life or the love coming through there. So it's a fascinating image, and obviously the builders of this church thought, oh, no, that's the image we want. I prefer an empty cross because he's not there anymore, and if he's not there anymore, you don't need to be there anymore.
I just wanted to make one comment on just the reason I was thinking about that is that there's this tradition where the rabbis ask the question, what happened to the tablets that Moses smashed before the new ones were, carved? And they say that after the tablets were smashed, the pieces were picked up and they were put in the tabernacle along with the new tablets, the brokenness along with the whole. Mm-hmm. I love that idea of the holiness of brokenness.
And that's right. In our communion service, you see that lived out every week. It's that same idea. And I think that in context of this is an acceptance of both sides of ourselves. If that animal side is our broken side, but that sounds judgmental, but they're both here.
Yeah.
That the physical is actually sanctified, that the animal side of us is actually made holy in that act. And so it gets back to this both and, which is pretty cool. We're just about out of time, but we do want to have some time for questions. I see a hand up there already. Go ahead. The shepherd image, the other image that shows up a lot is the fish and other things that are really more about nurturing and caring, right? Yeah, we could get off on original sin or on the Middle Ages, but as Christianity evolved, through up into the Middle Ages, this idea of suffering and everything. Without going into a long thing, I think that has a lot to do with power. It has to do with a feudal society and reflecting that society and values of that medieval world in the Roman Empire. And Jesus was, was really not part of the empire. He was really rebelling against it. But then the empire embraced and then took that power structure. So yes, how much of that is based on fear or based, transformed some of the original that wasn't as harsh? So interesting question. Somebody else?
Do you think it would be possible to have some classes during the fall or winter?
We've got to figure that out.
I think we can talk.
Please do. Please do.
Yeah.
Neither of you used the phrase self-will, which I always considered sort of the right phrase for what God gave you that sometimes creates all this stuff by misusing the instincts. And also you didn't use that word. I guess I just asked you what your thoughts are on self-will.
So God created us in God's image. And I would say God is love, and so we're created to be in loving relationship and to love. God is also, if we're creating God's image, part of that is being co-creators with God. Part of that is free will, the ability to make decisions, the ability, so free will is a big part of this. That Indian story of, Cherokee story of the two wolves, which you feed, and setting the limits, all of that is part of that free will kind of agency. It's putting that responsibility back on us.
I like the question. It's so essentially within each of us we have we're trying to find the balance is the way that I would describe it. But how do you refrain from actually moving to the place that might feel good, the vices, if you will, when it becomes lust or it becomes greed or it becomes something that is negative. And I think within us, again, it goes back to the idea of the measure of a person or the measure of someone's character is after they've gone astray, how well can they come back? I think to another degree, there's a measure of how well can you keep yourself from actually straying too much off the path as well. I think that's certainly a measure of character also.
So our bells are about to go off. You said you like the bells.
I do.
Holy envy
I have
for
holy
the
envy
bells.
for bells, absolutely.
So I think what we'll do is adjourn to Hoy Hall and have coffee. There's some wonderful food, and we continue our conversations there. So thank you again
everyone.
for joining us. So.